The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Boston estate offered a pristine view of a quiet, affluent neighborhood, a flawless picture of success that mirrored the marriage it housed, impeccable on the outside, quietly fracturing within. A misplaced silver cufflink on the marble counter and a notification lighting up a screen in the dead of night were the only physical ghosts of a ruinous betrayal. A perfectly constructed lie was about to unravel, caught in the silent, unblinking eye of a lens she never knew existed. Behind the locked doors of high society, the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in plain sight. If you are drawn to the quiet tension of trust, deception, and the heavy price of betrayal, stay with me as this story unfolds. The rain in Boston had a way of washing the city clean, but tonight it only seemed to make the limestone facade of the Sinclair estate look colder. Maximilian Sinclair sat in the driveway inside his idling Audi, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers the only sound anchoring him to reality. Through the rain-slicked windshield, he watched the warm amber glow spilling from the living room windows. It was the picture of domestic perfection, a masterpiece he had funded with endless, grueling hours at Wright Architecture. Yet, a heavy, suffocating dread pooled in his stomach. Inside, Arabella St. James would be waiting. She always was, perfectly poised, a glass of Sancerre in her hand, her smile as flawlessly constructed as the glass and steel high-rises Maximilian designed. But lately, the structural integrity of that smile was failing. It never quite reached her eyes. He killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and deafening. Maximilian stepped into the house, immediately hit by the familiar, expensive scent of Santal burning in the grand foyer. "Max, is that you, darling?" Arabella's voice drifted from the kitchen, melodic and light. Too light. "Just me," he called back, shrugging off his damp wool coat. He walked into the kitchen. Arabella stood by the expansive marble island, wearing a silk slip dress that caught the ambient lighting. She turned, offering him a practiced porcelain smile that belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. "Rough day at the firm?" she asked, stepping forward to brush a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead. Her touch was feather-light, almost reluctant, like a ghost grazing his skin. "The usual," Maximilian replied, his dark eyes casually scanning the counter. Courtney found a structural flaw in the new downtown project. "Kept us late." "Courtney," Arabella repeated, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening around the corners of her eyes. She always was so thorough. Maximilian didn't miss the subtle, venomous edge in her tone, but his attention was abruptly seized by something else entirely. Resting near the edge of the island, half hidden by a stack of sorted mail, was a silver cufflink. Intricate, heavy, stamped with a custom monogram. R.B. Robert Brown. His former college roommate, a titan in corporate finance, and a man who hadn't been invited to their home in over 6 months. Or so Maximilian thought. He felt the air leave his lungs, a sharp, icy prickle dancing down his spine. He didn't look at the cufflink. He didn't let his gaze linger for even a fraction of a second. The survival instincts of a man operating in high-stakes corporate warfare kicked in. Instead, he met his wife's eyes, mirroring her pristine, empty smile perfectly. "Did you have visitors today?" he asked casually, reaching past her for a bottle of sparkling water from the refrigerator. Arabella's hand paused as she reached for her wineglass. The hesitation lasted barely a heartbeat, a micro-expression of panic, quickly smoothed over by years of social conditioning. "No, just a quiet day. The housekeeper came by at noon, but that was it." A lie. Smooth, effortless, and terrifyingly casual. Maximilian unscrewed the cap of the water bottle. The sharp hiss of escaping carbonation sounded like a warning shot in the quiet room. He took a slow sip, his mind racing through 100 different scenarios, 100 explosive confrontations. But the architect in him took over. An architect doesn't tear down a compromised, load-bearing wall without understanding the full extent of the structural damage first. You observe, you document, you prepare. "I'm exhausted," he finally said, turning toward the hallway, his voice devoid of any tremor. "I think I'm going to head straight up to shower." As he walked away, the soft, pale glow of a notification illuminated Arabella's phone resting on the counter. In the reflection of the dark, polished oven glass, Maximilian caught a fleeting glimpse of the screen coming to life. The house was utterly silent, But in Maximilian's mind, the foundations were already crumbling into dust. He realized, with a sickening, profound clarity, that the woman he had loved for 5 years was standing in their beautiful kitchen, calmly constructing a reality that didn't include him. He just didn't know yet how thoroughly she intended to bury him under the rubble. It took exactly 48 hours for the agonizing shock of betrayal to crystallize into cold, methodical action. Maximilian Sinclair did not confront Arabella. He did not raise his voice, nor did he demand an explanation for the silver cufflink left like a careless taunt on their marble island. Instead, he retreated into the sanctuary of his profession. He was a master architect. He understood that when a foundation is compromised, you do not immediately start tearing down walls. You assess the structural integrity. You map the decay. The security hardware was shipped to a discreet locker near Wright Architecture's downtown office. They were high-end, matte black micro cameras, no larger than the head of a standard drywall screw, equipped with infrared sensors and encrypted cloud uplink capabilities. The installation occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. Arabella's shared digital calendar claimed she was attending a charity luncheon in Beacon Hill, giving Maximilian a rare 3-hour window of total solitude in the Boston estate. He moved through the house with a cordless drill and a chilling sense of purpose. He felt a sickening twist of violation in his gut as he worked. He was desecrating the very sanctuary he had built for them. But the image of Robert Brown stepping into these rooms, pouring wine from their cellar, touching the woman Maximilian loved, silenced any lingering guilt. Maximilian applied his architectural expertise to the sightlines. He embedded a lens inside the recessed lighting fixture above the kitchen island. Another was concealed within the intricate crown molding of the grand living room. The final, most painful installation was in his own private study, tucked behind the binding of a thick volume on mid-century design. He calculated the angles perfectly, ensuring intersecting fields of view that left no blind spots in the primary living areas. By the time the sun dipped below the Boston skyline, casting long gray shadows across the hardwood floors, the house was heavily wired. Maximilian sat alone in his study, the heavy mahogany door locked tight. He opened his personal laptop, entered a complex series of passcodes, and launched the proprietary surveillance software. The screen flickered, then divided into a crisp, high-definition grid. There was his kitchen, pristine and empty. There was the living room, the Persian rug bathed in the fading evening light. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience. He was looking at his own life, reduced to a sterile, silent broadcast. The front door chimed. On the upper left quadrant of his screen, the foyer camera caught Arabella stepping inside. Maximilian held his breath. He watched his wife through the monitor, stripped of his physical presence. Without an audience, the radiant, porcelain mask she wore for the world dissolved. Her posture slouched slightly. Her expression was hard, drawn tight with a nervous, calculating energy. She didn't bother taking off her trench coat. Instead, she immediately pulled her phone from her designer handbag, her thumbs moving furiously across the screen. Maximilian reached for his mouse and clicked the audio icon. The room's ambient silence was suddenly replaced by the faint rustle of Arabella's coat through the laptop speakers. She lifted the phone to her ear. "It's me," she said, her voice dropping to a hushed, urgent whisper that echoed through the hidden microphone. "No, he's still at the firm. He doesn't suspect a thing, Robert. He's completely oblivious." In the dim light of the study, Maximilian sat perfectly still. The confirmation hit him like a physical blow to the chest, driving the air from his lungs. "Just give me a few more weeks," Arabella continued, pacing the length of the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. "I need more time to copy the Wright Architecture financial drives on his laptop. Once I have those, the embezzlement narrative will be airtight. We take the house, the shares, everything. He won't know what hit him." She laughed then, a short, breathless sound devoid of any warmth. Maximilian stared at the glowing screen. The man who had loved Arabella St. James died quietly in that dark room, buried beneath the weight of her treachery. As he watched his wife plot his absolute destruction in high definition, the architect took over, ready to draft his counter-design. The drafting room at Wright Architecture was deserted, the overhead fluorescent lights dialed down to a low, hum-free glow. Maximilian sat alone at his dual-monitor workstation. On his left screen rested the complex structural blueprints for a new seaport high-rise, an intricate web of steel and glass. On the right screen played a live, encrypted feed of his own living room. It was a Thursday night. He had texted Arabella 3 hours ago, claiming he was pulling an all-nighter to finalize schematics. On the right monitor, Robert Brown poured himself a generous measure of Maximilian's Macallan 25. Robert looked exactly as he had a decade ago in their Ivy League dorms. Only the raw arrogance was now tailored into a charcoal Brioni suit. He handed a crystal tumbler to Arabella, who was curled up on the imported Italian leather sofa. In the sterile glow of the infrared night vision, she looked like a ghost, beautiful, untouchable, and entirely ruthless. "The offshore accounts are prepped," Robert said, his voice carrying a slight metallic echo through the hidden microphone concealed in the crown molding. "I've routed the dummy shell company to look exactly like the subcontractor accounts Wright Architecture uses for materials. All we need is the transfer authorization from his secure laptop." Arabella took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch. "I'll get his master password this weekend. He leaves the machine unlocked when he takes his Sunday run. It'll take me 5 minutes to initiate the transfer." "Good. That handles the financial ruin." Robert smirked, loosening his silk tie. He sat down next to her, closing the physical distance. "And the rest of it? The restraining order?" Maximilian's hand hovered over his mouse. His knuckles were bone white. The temperature in his dark office seemed to plummet, a sudden chill settling deep in his marrow. Arabella leaned into Robert, her manicured fingers lazily tracing the lapel of his jacket. "Next Friday. The firm's annual gala is on Saturday. I'll start an argument after dinner. I'll make sure the neighbors hear shouting. Then I'll call the precinct. I already have the theatrical makeup for the bruising on my arm and cheekbone. By the time he's out on bail, the story will have leaked to the board of directors. They'll force him out to save the firm's reputation, and the prenuptial morality clause will trigger. I get the house, the liquid assets, and his shares." Robert chuckled, a low, predatory sound that made Maximilian's stomach turn. He leaned in and kissed her, watching another man kiss his wife in the home he had paid for. Plotting his imprisonment should have broken Maximilian. It should have elicited a scream, a shattered monitor, a frantic drive across Boston to tear them apart with his bare hands. But as he watched the grotesque intimacy play out in high definition, Maximilian felt nothing but a terrifying, absolute stillness. The man who had vowed to cherish Arabella St. James died completely in that office chair. In his place sat a master architect, coldly analyzing the structural flaws of his enemy's design. They were arrogant. They believed they were operating in a vacuum, relying entirely on his predictable, honorable nature. They assumed he would fight them in the light, where Arabella's fabricated tears and Robert's financial acrobatics would blind the judge and the jury. Maximilian reached forward and pressed the record icon on the surveillance software. A small red dot appeared in the upper corner of the feed, quietly capturing the rope they were eagerly braiding to hang themselves. He didn't need to fight them in court. He didn't need to defend himself against a staged domestic disturbance. An architect knows that the most efficient way to defeat a toxic structure isn't to attack it with a sledgehammer. It's to quietly walk away, remove the load-bearing pillars from afar, and let gravity do the rest. He looked at the physical calendar taped to his desk partition. Next Friday, 8 days. Maximilian closed the laptop, plunging his workstation into total darkness. It was time to pack. Friday arrived with the heavy, oppressive humidity typical of a Boston summer, the air thick and unmoving. Inside the Sinclair estate, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled, the surfaces gleaming, the house entirely unaware of the violence it was scheduled to host that evening. Maximilian Sinclair moved through the master bedroom with the terrifying precision of a ghost. He had spent the last 8 days systematically dismantling his physical and digital existence. There had been no frantic packing sessions in the dead of night, no dramatic farewells or lingering looks at old photographs. He had routed his personal funds through secure, untraceable channels with the quiet, deniable assistance of Courtney Hill. He had cloned his secure laptop, wiping the original machine clean of any financial data Arabella and Robert could manipulate, leaving behind only the benign, useless files of a busy architect. Now, he zipped a single, unmarked leather duffel bag. It contained his passport, essential legal documents, and enough clothing for a week. The rest of his life, the rows of custom-tailored suits, the vintage watch collection, the life he had built brick by expensive brick to match Arabella's ambitions, he left untouched. To take them would be to leave a motive, a narrative of a fleeing, guilty man. He needed to be a man who simply ceased to exist. Before leaving the bathroom, he slid the platinum wedding band off his left ring finger. It felt strangely heavy. He set it down gently on the edge of the marble sink, a silent monument to a dead marriage. At 3 p.m., 4 hours before Arabella was scheduled to begin her theatrical performance, Maximilian walked out the front door. He didn't look back. He drove his Audi to a long-term parking garage at Logan International, wiped down the steering wheel, left the keys in the ignition, and walked away. A black car took him to a brutalist, short-term rental apartment in South Boston, leased weeks prior under a layered corporate shell name. By 7 p.m., he was sitting in the dark. The harsh, pale glow of his laptop screen was the only light illuminating his stoic face. The surveillance feed was live. Arabella entered the estate at exactly 7:15 p.m. She was dressed elegantly in a neutral silk blouse and dark trousers, but there was a frantic, rehearsed energy to her movements. She checked her phone, likely confirming the timeline with Robert, before walking into the center of the living room. She paused, looking around the pristine space. "Max," she called out. The hidden microphone embedded in the crown molding picked up the slight tremor of anticipation in her voice. "Max, I know you're home. We need to talk about the firm." Silence. The house absorbed her voice, offering nothing in return. Maximilian watched her brow furrow. She walked to the kitchen, then down the hall to his study. Finding them empty, the digital locks untouched, she returned to the living room. Her posture stiffened. According to the script she had rehearsed with Robert, this was the moment the argument was supposed to escalate. She stood in the center of the Persian rug, her eyes darting toward the hallway, visibly recalculating her reality. She pulled a small cosmetics compact from her designer handbag. With practiced, clinical strokes, she applied a purplish-yellow cream to her left cheekbone and the edge of her jawline. She blended it flawlessly. It looked sickeningly realistic under the warm amber lighting, mimicking the blunt force trauma of a heavy hand. Then, she took a deep, shuddering breath. She picked up a heavy crystal vase from the entryway console table and hurled it violently against the hardwood floor. It shattered with a jagged, explosive crash. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream. "Stop, Max! Please stop!" She collapsed to the floor, sobbing hysterically into the empty room, her hands shielding her face from a phantom attacker. She crawled toward the landline on the side table, her performance immaculate, her tears genuine in their physical intensity. She pulled the receiver down and dialed 911. "Help me," she wept into the phone, her voice breaking with perfect, engineered terror. "My husband. He went crazy. He hit me. He tore up the house and stormed out. Please, I'm terrified he's coming back." In his dark, sterile apartment across the city, Maximilian took a slow sip of black coffee. He watched the woman he had loved perform her violent masterpiece to an audience of dust motes and shadows. He felt a profound, freezing emptiness, realizing that the most terrifying lies are the ones spoken to an empty room. He did not blink. The architect had left the building, and the demolition had officially begun. A week had passed since the police took Arabella's statement in the living room, their heavy boots tracking mud across the Persian rug. The Boston elite had rallied around her with suffocating speed. There had been sprawling bouquets of white lilies delivered to the door, hushed, sympathetic phone calls from the wives of Wright Architecture board members, and a temporary restraining order granted by a judge who looked at her meticulously applied bruises with profound, paternal pity. By all societal metrics, the execution of the plan was flawless. Yet, the Sinclair estate had never felt more like a tomb. Arabella sat at the marble kitchen island, her manicured thumb swiping down on her phone screen to refresh her email for the 100th time that morning. Nothing. No angry messages from Maximilian, no frantic calls from his defense attorney begging for a quiet settlement, no credit card alerts from a sleazy motel or a downtown bar. He had simply evaporated into the humid New England air. The front door chimed, followed by the heavy, aggressive click of the deadbolt. Robert Brown stepped into the foyer, bypassing the usual pleasantries. His charcoal suit looked slightly rumpled, a stark departure from his usual immaculate tailoring, and the sharp, arrogant edge of his jaw was clenched tight. "Tell me you've heard something," Robert demanded, his voice slicing through the sterile silence of the house. He dropped a leather briefcase onto the island, the heavy thud making Arabella flinch. "Not a word," she replied, keeping her voice low. She pulled her silk robe tighter around her shoulders, suddenly feeling very cold. His phone goes straight to voicemail. His sister in Chicago hasn't seen him. It's like he never existed. Robert ran a tense hand through his hair, pacing the length of the kitchen. The police can't find his Audi. He didn't take a flight out of Logan under his own name. And the accounts. He stopped, planting his hands firmly on the marble countertop, leaning in until Arabella could smell the bitter, stale espresso on his breath. "The personal accounts are empty, Arabella. He transferred the liquid assets out days before you pulled the stunt in the living room. The work laptop you gave me, it was wiped clean. Factory reset. There are no financial drives." A cold, creeping dread wrapped around Arabella's throat, restricting her airway. "What do you mean, empty?" He didn't know Robert. He couldn't have known. He was completely normal. Normal men don't just disappear without their vintage watch collection and their passport. Robert snapped, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "He ghosted us. Do you understand what this means? We have a domestic abuse claim with no abuser to arrest, and an embezzlement frame job, with no money to trace. I have dummy corporations set up offshore that look completely dormant. We look like fools. Keep your voice down," Arabella hissed, her eyes darting instinctively toward the large windows, half expecting to see Maximilian standing on the manicured lawn. "The police think he's a fugitive. The board is preparing to invoke the morality clause to strip his shares. We just have to wait." "Wait for what?" Robert sneered, stepping back. The charm that had seduced her months ago was entirely gone, replaced by the cornered panic of a corporate shark smelling his own blood in the water. "He outplayed you. Or worse, you tipped him off. Are you out of your mind?" Arabella stood up, the heavy bar stool scraping harshly against the floorboards. "I shattered a vase and bruised my own face. I sat in a police precinct for 4 hours crying my eyes out. Why would I warn him? Because you're weak," Robert shot back coldly, his eyes narrowing. "Because maybe you couldn't stomach ruining the Golden Boy architect after all." Arabella stared at him, the silence between them suddenly toxic and suffocating. The alliance forged in expensive hotel beds and whispered promises of millions was fracturing under the weight of a single, absent man. High above them, hidden in the dark recesses of the recessed lighting fixture, the micro-camera's red light blinked steadily. It recorded every accusation, every crack in their defense, streaming it silently to an IP address across the city. Maximilian's ghost was haunting them perfectly. The rain returned to Boston, a persistent, freezing drizzle that turned the South End into a blur of gray concrete and neon reflections. Maximilian sat in the furthest booth of a dimly lit diner on Tremont Street, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The collar of his dark peacoat was turned up, casting a deep shadow over his features. He blended perfectly into the mid-morning anonymity of the city. The bell above the diner door chimed. Courtney Hill walked in. She shook the rain from her umbrella, her sharp eyes scanning the booths before locking onto him. Even in a casual trench coat, Courtney possessed a formidable, no-nonsense presence, the exact trait that made her the most lethal junior partner at Wright Architecture. She slid into the vinyl booth across from him, her expression a masterclass in controlled neutrality. "You look terrible, Max," she said quietly, placing a slim manila folder on the Formica table between them. "I've been dead for a week, Courtney. It takes a toll on the complexion," Maximilian replied, his voice raspy from days of deliberate underuse. Courtney didn't smile. She leaned forward, lowering her voice below the hum of the diner's broken jukebox. "The firm is in chaos. The board held an emergency session yesterday. HR is drafting termination papers citing the morality clause, and the police have officially classified you as a flight risk. Arabella is playing the traumatized survivor so well, she deserves an Emmy. The narrative spreading through the office is that you drained the accounts, beat your wife, and fled." Maximilian looked out the rain-streaked window. "And what do you believe?" Courtney studied him for a long, heavy moment. She was an architect who understood structural integrity better than anyone. She had worked alongside Maximilian for 6 years, She knew the meticulous, almost rigid morality that governed his life. I believe that a man who color-codes his drafting pencils doesn't snap and throw a crystal vase at his wife's head without leaving a trace of forensic evidence. I also believe you wouldn't have asked me to pull the firm's encrypted server logs if you were actually guilty. Maximilian felt a microscopic fracture in his icy exterior. A profound sense of relief washed over him. The first genuine human connection he had felt since the night he saw the silver cufflink on his kitchen island. He reached into his coat pocket and slid a heavy encrypted USB drive across the table. "There are 2 folders on this drive," Maximilian said, his tone shifting into pure clinical strategy. "The first contains a complete copy of my uncorrupted financial records and the dummy shell corporation Robert Brown set up to frame me for embezzlement. If you cross-reference the digital signatures with the server logs you brought, you'll see the IP addresses trace back to Robert's private servers, not mine." Courtney picked up the drive, her fingers tightening around the metal casing. Robert Brown. Of course. It always comes back to money and ego with him. "The second folder," Maximilian continued, the temperature in his voice dropping to absolute 0, "contains raw video and audio files. High-definition footage from inside my house. It details exactly how Arabella faked the assault, step by step, and their entire conversation planning my corporate ruin." Courtney's eyes widened slightly, the only crack in her professional armor. "You surveilled your own home?" "I diagnosed a structural failure," he corrected quietly, looking away, "and I documented the collapse." "What do you need me to do?" Courtney asked, slipping the drive into her leather bag. The hesitation was gone. The loyalty was absolute. "Tomorrow night is the firm's annual charity gala at the Fairmont," Maximilian said. "Arabella will be there. She needs the public sympathy of the board members to finalize the narrative before Monday morning. Robert will be there as her support system. I need you to bypass the AV team's security protocols during the keynote presentation." Courtney gave a slow, calculating nod, a dark understanding settling between them. "You don't just want to clear your name, Max. You want to demolish them on the biggest stage possible." "An architect knows," Maximilian murmured, picking up his cold coffee, "that if you don't clear the site completely, the rot just spreads to the new foundation. It's time to burn it down." The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was a sea of black-tie elegance and muted, strategic conversations. Beneath the glittering sweep of crystal chandeliers, the elite of Boston's architectural and financial sectors gathered for Wright Architecture's annual charity gala. The clinking of champagne flutes and the soft hum of a jazz quartet provided a veneer of civility to a room thrumming with predatory gossip. Arabella St. James stood near the center of the room, a picture of fragile resilience. She wore a high-necked, understated midnight blue gown, a deliberate sartorial choice that suggested a woman quietly recovering from unspeakable trauma. Robert Brown stood at her elbow, the dutiful, protective friend of the family, his hand hovering just inches from the small of her back. Board members approached her with hushed, solemn tones, offering sympathetic nods and promises of swift legal resolution regarding her missing husband's firm shares. Arabella offered them a brave, tremulous smile. It was the performance of a lifetime. Across the room, standing near the heavy velvet drapes of the AV control booth, Courtney Hill checked the face of her Cartier watch. 8:45 p.m. The keynote address on the firm's future was scheduled for 8:50 p.m. She caught Arabella's eye across the crowded floor. Arabella looked right through her, dismissing the junior partner entirely. Courtney simply turned back to the control panel, her thumb resting on the cold metal of Maximilian's encrypted USB drive. In his stark, unlit apartment in South Boston, Maximilian sat before his glowing laptop. He had tapped into the Fairmont's internal security feed. He watched Arabella accept a glass of sparkling water, her posture perfect, her lie airtight. His chest felt hollow, devoid of the righteous fury he thought he might feel. There was only the cold, mechanical precision of a demolition. At exactly 8:50 p.m., the managing director of Wright Architecture stepped up to the acrylic podium. The jazz quartet faded out. The room grew quiet, expectant. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director began, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. "Before we discuss the future of our firm, we must acknowledge the difficult transition we are currently navigating. We stand with those who have suffered." He gestured toward Arabella. The spotlight shifted, illuminating her. She lowered her eyes, a masterclass in dignified sorrow. To illustrate our commitment to transparency and moving forward, the director continued, pressing the clicker to start the corporate presentation. The three massive projection screens behind the podium flickered, but instead of the sleek, geometric logo of Wright Architecture, the screens went pitch black. A sharp, high-frequency hiss of raw audio feedback pierced the ballroom, causing several guests to flinch. Then, the black screens snapped to a stark, high-definition, infrared green. It was the Sinclair living room. The ballroom fell into a dead, horrifying silence. On the 30-foot screens, Robert Brown was pouring a glass of Macallan. Arabella was curled on the sofa. The offshore accounts are prepped, Robert's voice boomed through the Fairmont state-of-the-art surround sound, dripping with unmistakable arrogance. All we need is the transfer authorization from his secure laptop. Down on the ballroom floor, Arabella's champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the polished marble, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. The video cut abruptly to the next file. It was the night of the assault. The entire room watched in breathless, paralyzed shock as Arabella, alone in the frame, meticulously applied theatrical bruising makeup to her cheekbone. They watched her hurl the crystal vase against the floor. "Help me," the recorded Arabella wept, her fake 911 call playing over the speakers, while the visual showed her kneeling in an entirely empty room. "My husband, he went crazy," the murmurs began, a low, rising tide of revulsion and shock. Robert Brown's face drained of all color. He took a rapid, panicked step back from Arabella, instinctually trying to distance himself from the epicenter of the blast. Board members who had just offered Arabella their profound sympathies now stared at her with open disgust. Arabella stood frozen under the harsh glare of the spotlight. Her porcelain mask didn't just slip, it completely disintegrated. She looked wildly around the room, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, searching for Maximilian in the sea of horrified faces. But he wasn't there. He was miles away, sitting in the dark, watching the heavy, load-bearing walls of her magnificent lie finally collapse into dust. The morning rain over Boston finally gave way to a brittle, overcast chill. Inside Maximilian Sinclair's short-term rental, the silence was absolute. The dual monitors that had once broadcast the collapse of his marriage now sat dark and unplugged. There was no need for surveillance anymore. The demolition was complete. Over the past 72 hours, the fallout from the Fairmont Gala had been swift and merciless. Wright Architecture's board had not only reinstated Maximilian with full honors, but had publicly and aggressively severed all ties with Robert Brown's financial firm. The Boston police, humiliated by the high-profile manipulation, had swiftly pivoted their investigation. Arabella was now facing multiple felony counts of perjury, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The offshore shell companies Robert had so arrogantly established had been frozen by federal regulators before a single cent could be moved. Maximilian stood by the window, watching the gray, churning waves of the harbor. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Courtney Hill. The board officially signed the press release. "The firm is yours. Drinks tonight to celebrate?" He stared at the illuminated text. Celebrate. The word felt foreign, sharp, and entirely inappropriate. He typed a brief, polite decline, citing exhaustion, and set the phone face down on the laminate counter. He walked into the sparse living room. In his mind's eye, he didn't see the triumph of his meticulously executed counterdraft. He saw Arabella's face in the ballroom, the exact moment the massive projection screens behind her flashed into infrared green. He remembered the sharp crack of her shattering champagne flute, the horrified gasps of their peers, and the visceral, cornered terror in the eyes of the woman he had once vowed to protect. He had won. He had executed the perfect architectural defense, dismantling a toxic structure before it could collapse and crush him. He had his wealth, his pristine reputation, and his freedom. Yet, as he looked around the sterile, unfamiliar walls of the South Boston apartment, a profound, suffocating emptiness settled deep into his chest. A man cannot burn down his own home, even one infested with rot, and walk away without smelling the smoke on his clothes for the rest of his life. On the small, cheap dining table sat a thick manila envelope from his legal team, the divorce papers. The asset division was entirely in his favor. The prenuptial agreement's morality clause had been triggered flawlessly in front of 300 witnesses, stripping Arabella of any claim to his firm shares or their shared accounts. The house in the suburbs, the pristine limestone facade, the marble kitchen island, the Persian rug where a crystal vase had been deliberately shattered, was already listed for sale. He would never step foot inside it again. Maximilian pulled the documents from the envelope. He didn't bother reading the dense legalese. He flipped directly to the last page, the paper crisp and unforgiving under his hand. He picked up his favorite drafting pen and signed his name with steady, deliberate strokes. He set the pen down. The quiet of the apartment pressed in on him, heavy and absolute. There was no betrayal left to uncover, no enemy left to outmaneuver. There was only the cold, hard truth of survival. Maximilian Sinclair walked back to the window, watching the city lights begin to flicker on against the encroaching dusk. He was a master architect, a man who spent his life building monuments meant to withstand the test of time. But as he stood alone in the dark, he finally understood the heaviest cost of his vindication, the realization that some foundations, once shattered, can never be rebuilt.